We routinely model the history of human thought as a straight line. We place philosophical doctrines and artistic movements into a neat sequence, passing the baton from one era to the next. This linear timeline is a pedagogical convenience. It assumes that a new set of ideas neatly replaces its predecessor, clearing the stage for the next intellectual generation. Under this model, we assign a starting point. We look at classical naturalism, with its strict focus on proportion and physical reality, as the foundation. Centuries later, Impressionism emerges to dissolve those hard lines into sensory experience, supposedly rendering older forms of representation obsolete. Finally, Modernism arrives. Cubism fractures the image and overthrows the remnants of the 19th century aesthetic. Historians often try to fix this oversimplification by drawing a branching tree, allowing one movement to spawn several successors. But in this diagram, the branches never cross or reconnect. History does not consist of deaths and replacements. Cultural evolution expands the available organizational space, and mapping that space requires a different geometry. To see how this space actually operates, we can look at the massive temporal overlap of intellectual movements. Consider Europe between 1905 and 1914. Realism, Impressionism, and Cubism were not sequential. They coexisted, communicating in the exact same historical window. Even dormant branches routinely reactivate. Ideas from antiquity loop forward into neoclassicism, merging with different cultural streams to form new movements. These merges often involve geographically distinct systems. Non-Western artistic traditions entered the European environment and actively reorganized the avant-garde. The African visual vocabulary, reliant on abstracted, geometric forms, became a direct input for European artists looking to break away from literal representation. Consequently, the people operating within these environments did not belong to a single doctrine. They constructed their work by selecting and combining components from several available traditions simultaneously. A painter working in Paris during this time could process Renaissance perspective, Impressionist color theory, and African geometry within a single canvas. The accurate mathematical representation of this culture is a directed recombining network. It possesses structural memory, dictating how it processes future information. The logic is continuous. Previous organization plus new input forces the network to stabilize into a reconfigured organization. This macro-level network geometry of overlapping, history-dependent configurations gives us the exact mathematical model needed to understand the microscopic dynamics of the human brain. If we scale down from human history to the neural environment, we find a similar organizational pattern. While the physical anatomy of the brain remains relatively stable, the functional connectivity running through those neurons is highly fluid. At any given moment, the brain recruits a specific combination of nodes and connection weights to execute a task. We call this temporary functional state its dynamic geometry. This diagram illustrates a traditional, flawed assumption in cognitive science. It shows a visual network in red and an auditory network in blue. The assumption was that multisensory perception operates by simple addition, stacking isolated sensory networks on top of each other. But integration forces the participating networks to change their topologies. When visual and auditory signals converge, they form an emergent, unified configuration that operates differently than its individual parts. This resulting geometry is nonlinear. Its shape is dictated by the brain's current state of attention, the immediate context, and the history of processing that happened milliseconds prior. Perception is a dynamically emergent functional geometry that constantly overwrites itself. A single anatomical brain manages these constant overwrites by supporting 3 overlapping layers of connectivity simultaneously. This glowing cluster represents active connectivity. These are the specific pathways currently carrying task-relevant coordinated activity. Surrounding them is supporting connectivity. These networks aren't performing the primary task, but they regulate arousal, attention, and frontoparietal control to keep the active cluster functioning. Finally, the rest of the graph represents latent connectivity. These connections are anatomically available, but remain unexpressed until a new input demands their recruitment. Because these layers operate simultaneously, the neural network possesses a wide distribution of intrinsic timescales. Some networks execute instantaneous reactions and fade immediately. Others persist over time, maintained by recurrent activity, working memory, and short-term plasticity. By retaining traces of prior states across these varying timescales, the latent and supporting networks ensure the brain functions as a history-dependent medium. This creates a mathematical tension. How do you model a network that carries activity while its physical structure is simultaneously being altered by that exact same activity? This flowchart maps the reciprocal feedback loop. The geometry of the network constrains where activity can flow. That flowing activity then modifies the effective connectivity. Finally, that modification persists, feeding back into the underlying geometry. To solve the math behind this loop, we can test a modeling hypothesis borrowed from physics, treating the brain as network viscoelastic. In material science, viscoelastic fluids exhibit a combination of instantaneous response, delayed relaxation, and history dependence. We see analogous behaviors in neural dynamics. On the left, physical mechanical memory slowly relaxes after being compressed. On the right, a neural network exhibits history-dependent response, dimming slowly as it retains residual strain from a recent input. The multiple springs on the left define a physical relaxation spectrum. We can map this to the multiple neural timescales we observe in the brain, where different functional pathways decay at different rates. Finally, this graph illustrates a hysteresis loop, a state where the path taken dictates the final resting condition. On the right, we see the neural equivalent, path-dependent transitions, where the routing alters itself based on the sequence of prior inputs. Applying this framework forces us to stop treating cognitive states as rigid structures. They are temporarily stabilized trajectories within an ongoing, history-dependent flow. If we pull back from the microscopic level, we can map this same structural logic across the organizational spectrum. Our physical environment interacts with our biological receptors, generating the dynamic neural geometries that dictate perception. Those internal cognitive states require physical mediation, speech, writing, art, to communicate with others. When those communications aggregate, they build the overlapping social and cultural movements that shape history. This creates a continuity of organization. We exist inside a stack of nested networks, translating across every interface. Crucially, this doesn't mean the brain and society obey identical physical laws. The interfaces translate logic, but the physical reality differs. The term network-viscoelastic-like provides a generalized mathematical formalism. It gives us a shared language to measure structural memory and flow across different scales of human existence. A theoretical framework is only as valuable as the falsifiable predictions it generates. To prove this model has merit, we must look for specific behaviors in the brain. The first prediction is neural path dependence. If the brain is truly network viscoelastic, then feeding it an identical final stimulus via completely different preceding sequences must yield measurably different final network configurations. The second prediction tests for hysteresis-like behavior in brain state transitions. If an experimental control parameter is gradually increased until it triggers a state transition and then decreased, the network reverts to its original state at an asymmetrical, much lower threshold. If adding memory kernels and relaxation spectra improves our ability to predict out-of-sample neural responses, the model shifts from a descriptive analogy to a functional explanation of brain dynamics.